Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're very pleased to say we have an education expert with us today to talk about the topic of whether school is still right for your child. So at this point, I'll hand over to Val to get us going. Oh, you'll need to unmute, Val.
Yes, I am. Sorry. Right. Okay. Yes, I particularly want to focus on home education, hence the title EHE advice. That stands for elective home education advice. But I actually come to this role from a variety of other roles. So I first of all started off as a teacher and did that for about 10 years. Then I taught teachers, and I did that for most of my career, but I was never absolutely full-time. Sometimes I only worked 4 days. And so, and that was while I was bringing up my children. And then I got asked by the local authority if I would, because I had been an Ofsted inspector, whether I would work for them on a consultative basis, and under inspection services, the home education could be reported on, if you like. So I was an advisor, independent, self-employed, and advising families and reporting to them. And I'll explain all of that. Now, I've done that for 16 years. And I also came to it because there was a time when I wanted to home educate my own child. In the end, I didn't. But my PhD is also on parents as educators of their children. So it all kind of sort of came together in this. Now, the other roles I no longer do. I no longer do teacher education. I retired early from that last September, but I do still do this. So I bring about 16 years of experience to doing this, and I do still work for my local authority, which is why I'm somewhat flying under the radar for this. Not because I'm going to say anything that's controversial, but it kind of protects the fact that I can speak more candidly to you guys. So the agenda, if we can have the next slide, Daisy. Yeah, so it's a very minimalist approach. I don't want to flood you with slides. I want to let you know that there is a structure to this, but I particularly want to get to that last one, which is your questions and then my responses to those. So the first thing to understand is that there is a legal framework surrounding home education. Because there is a law, that's what results in me having the role that I have. And the law is very, very short. It's basically every parent has the legal duty to provide a full-time, suitable, efficient education for their child. And that's everyone. That's not just those who home educate. Now, we are mostly, a lot of us, discharge that duty to the school. And so, you know, no questions asked. But everyone is allowed to decide to fulfill that responsibility themselves. And there are a couple of reasons why it might be problematic, and I'll explain those. So the local authority has a duty of care for the education of all children in its jurisdiction. However, it also delegates its duty to the schools where the children are there. And it used to monitor the schools, but we know that Ofsted does that now. So it actually has a very low-key role with the children who are in school. They assume, unless the school is in deep trouble, that those children are fine. But the local authority does have a duty to all those children. So when you remove the layer of school, it actually puts them a bit closer to those children. The law hasn't changed. There's no different law, but it's just there isn't that layer for them where they can sit behind. It's not a hiding behind, but it's a sit behind, because unless someone's telling them the school's in deep trouble, they don't have to be involved with those children. But if you take that layer away, then the law requires them to have a duty of care for the education of all children, but they've got no one who is fulfilling that role between them. So anyway, that's just the legal framework. The other bit of the law is that because of that duty of care to all children, including those who are home educated, they have to engage with the parents. And the monitoring of that from the local authority comes under Section 7 of the Education Act. It comes under inspection services, which is why they procured my services, if you like. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have active advisory involvement, but we will come to that under the role of the local authority. So that when you decide, you know, the school isn't right for you, and increasingly I've watched a very different trajectory and traction of parents choosing to home educate. When I first did this 16 years ago, I tended to get those who, for ideological and philosophical reasons, wanted their children out of school. And sometimes they never were in school. So from when the child was conceived, they never expected that. And I used to pick up quite a lot of those families. I now say, almost exclusively, it's not a home education by design, it's a home education by default, because something has gone wrong with the school, which has resulted in their child actually needing to be home educated. I'm picking up a lot of traumatized children, and that's been an increasing phenomenon, I'd say. So what you have to do is really simple. You have to notify your school that you want to remove your child. Now, from the school roll. Now, in the past, you didn't really have to expect anything else, but the school has now been lent on by Ofsted, actually, Department for Education, to have a meeting with the parent to discuss whether it's necessary to do that. I don't think that's obligatory, but the school are obliged to offer it. So you just need to notify them, and then there's a form, usually in 2 parts, which you fill in giving the reason, and then the school fills in their part, explaining what they see as the reason for this, and then that goes to the local authority. Now, on most of those forms, I can only talk in detail about the local authority I work for. They do ask if there are any safeguarding concerns, or if there are any other special need concerns, any child protection concerns. So the only reasons that you cannot home educate your child, or there would be at least an investigation into it, is one, if there are safeguarding concerns and they have evidence that there are safeguarding concerns. And the other reason is because it's not viable, in that, let's say, the parents are not literate themselves. So they really are the only 2 reasons that you wouldn't, or there'd be further investigation, if you like. So they're looking to see whether the school can give them some evidence of that, or they're looking to see if they can find out in any other way. So that communication between the school and the local authority is key for them to decide whether they need to intervene anymore. Now, it does vary after that in terms of the local authority. And I do know that the local authority I work for has been praised for the fact that it does offer quite a good professional service to families. So the local authority have to have some engagement on an annual basis, at least, with the parents, which could simply mean that the parent writes in and tells them what they're doing. They don't have to have active advisor involvement, and some authorities won't have advisors. They won't have professionals like me. They will have like an admin, and it might well be that you're, in some cases, are given you're interviewed by the admin person, the roles and the law is explained to you, and then you say that's fine, and then you go off and do it, and then you have to write to them each year. So that is the legal framework and the role of the local authority in that. Perhaps I should pause, because that's the kind of official bit before we get into, once you decide to do that, what would you like to do? I think I didn't intend to do that, Daisy, but I'm just thinking that's quite a lot of information, and people might not want to wait to the end to ask questions about that sort of official stuff.
So would anyone like to ask any questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. And sorry, I can see some of you are experiencing problems with part of the screen being chopped off, but I'm not sure. It looks fine on mine, so I'm not quite sure what to do about it. Sorry.
No, shall I carry on then?
I've got a question. Is the process exactly the same when the child has EHC plan, or it's just we need to notify the school that we want to home educate, or do we need to do like anything else?
That's a really good question, actually. It was one that I neglected to put on here, because increasingly the children with special needs are the ones that are coming out of school because the school are no longer fulfilling their needs. Since academisation, it appears to me that school pupils become profit and loss. And you know, a child that needs a lot of extra help, since schools have run their own budgets and no longer have a separate fund they can apply to for special needs, they seem quite reluctant to use that budget, because it comes from within their total budget, if you see what I mean. So in the past, if there was a special needs child, the local authority still retained the funding to provide that, and schools would make a bid to it and it would be sent that way. Now, increasingly, schools are operating almost like private companies where they get the money and then they decide how to do it. That's the only reason I can explain why I'm getting such a tranche of special needs children coming out and the parents telling me they should have had this, but they didn't. Now, with an EHC plan, that is a legal document that will follow that child, providing they're in education or training in a full-time basis until they're 25. Now, that doesn't oblige the parent, but it does oblige the local authority. Now, it comes with a lot of responsibility for providing those children's needs. However, it doesn't come with funding. And that's another reason why I'm seeing schools not apply for an EHC plan for the children in their care. And it's also another reason why I'm seeing children with EHC plans come out, because the school are not, even if there's a plan in place, fully meeting that need. So what happens in that case, if a parent feels really unhappy with what school are doing and their child has got an EHC plan, that stands for Education, Health and Care, then what is happening there is that largely the EHC plan is filed. So it's not active, but it hasn't gone away. It will stay there till the child is 25. The parent only has to follow that plan or access that plan if they want further local authority involvement. So you're not obliged to do anything with it if you take your child out of school, but they will just note that they will file it. However, I've been campaigning for the fact that that isn't good enough. And I'm saying, I think the resources that were put in place for that child should still follow the child when a parent is home educating, so that their status is EHE. However, they can still have the resources which in some cases allowed them to go to rainbow horses, or allowed them to go to special workshops, or allowed them to have some alternate provision. But I'm only winning it where I am in my local authority, but I'm not necessarily saying that is countrywide. But it is something that any home educated parent with a child with an EHC plan could further with the local authority. Are there any other questions?
Hi there. How does it work with children's sort of social socializing and community, etc.?
Yeah, so we get to that a little bit later on in the agenda.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. Shall I go on to the curriculum matters now then? Yeah. Okay, so when it comes to the curriculum matters, there's a very important thing that home educating parents often don't know because no one's telling them. You are not obliged to follow the national curriculum whatsoever. You do not have to do any of that. Remember, you only have to follow an education which is suitable, efficient and full-time. And nobody can oblige you to follow the national curriculum at all. If I were to design a first-class, world-class education, I would not start with the national curriculum. Okay. So there's no reason for any parent to want to do that. Now, there is a caveat there. If you decide not to follow the national curriculum and to have a completely organic, holistic provision, then you do have to be accepting this is a long-term decision where you may not, and your child may not, and that's the difficult thing, ever want to access school again. So my advice to most parents, particularly with young children, because we don't know, I mean, these biddable little primary school children can become sort of tyrants of their parents when they get to teenage years and say, I want to go to school, I want to do this. So my advice, and it can only be advice, is I think it's sensible, even within a completely organic, holistic provision, to at least track the national curriculum in English and maths. And the reason for that is that if they did decide to go back into school, they would be assessed on those subjects in terms of which sets they were in, which groups they were on, which tables they're in. And you don't want your child, and that only is testing subject knowledge. It's not actually testing potential. And you don't want to have built your child's self-esteem, self-confidence, and everything else to make them feel that they are hugely successful learners, to then have to then decide they want to go back into school, and then to have to take these assessments, and then to find out that they couldn't answer a lot of them. So that's my advice, that if you are completely sure, 100% sure your child will never go back into a school setting, you can do what you like, providing it's suitable, efficient, and full-time. And I can certainly start to recommend what I would do instead of following the national curriculum. But in most cases, I'd say at least track it. It doesn't mean you put it in front of the children. It doesn't mean that they'd spend, 45 minutes a day doing their literacy. It doesn't mean that, but it means you're designing your super duper creative curriculum with an eye on what skills and knowledge content you can weave into it, which doesn't disadvantage them later on. So again, shall I just pause there? Because that is again another meaty subject, isn't it? Okay, so you're going. I would be saying this if I were listening to me talking here. What is a first class, world class education?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I think, okay, is that knowledge should not be categorized in the way that schools do. It's basically a shorthand way and an efficient strategy for them to get subject experts. Of course, we don't tend to do that in primary school, but by the time we get to secondary school, we do. Although actually, in more recent years, primary schools are following the secondary school model. We've even got, primary subject specialists and so on. But we know that knowledge itself is not compartmentalized in that way. Now, interestingly, my local authority is going to, I think, move more and more towards the written report rather than the active advisor involvement. And I can tell you what I do when I work with them. But they've kind of said to me, to all of us, there's about 8 of us in my county now, we're going to want to assess these written reports. Now, neither of the 2 people who are running this are educationalists, so they kind of rely on the 8 self-employed who are experts in this to guide them. And I got involved to say, well, if you're going to assess these written reports, you're going to have some criteria for which the parents are following, because you don't assess anything if they don't know what they're working towards assessment. It makes sense to me. And then I said, you've got a real problem, because you're not allowed to assess anything according to the national curriculum. So how do you begin to draw up that kind of guidance? Now, I think it's possible, and I've obviously had my hat on thinking about this. And I think you've got to design something which is, first of all, not controversial to any family and not age specific. That's how broad and global some of the things are. And for me, I would be thinking along these lines. developing an awareness in, developing understanding in the child, sorry, I'll say that again, developing a curiosity in the child about the world, how it works, and the people in it. Now that can cover science, that can cover geography, that can cover religion. You don't have to call it any of that, but you just have to show evidence. And of course, who wouldn't want their child to be curious about the world, how it works, and the people in it? And that actually could be the Oxbridge candidate who's working on dark matter, as well as the primary 5-year-old who's finding out who's in their local park and, you know, making contact with them. So I think we've got to think those kinds of things through. Now, I haven't been yet asked to design this, but I'd be more than happy to share once I'm procured for this work, because I find that an incredibly exciting professional ambition. What would I start with? You know, what would I want every child? What kind of things no parent would balk at? I think another one is, how do you develop your child's voice to be an effective communicator within their family, within their community, within their society? And again, I think that can apply to any age. And why wouldn't we want our children being effective communicators? You know, and then when it comes to working within a literate and numerate society, there's a way of saying empowering your child to be able to be fully functioning within a literate and numerate world. So it's work in progress for me, but it's very exciting because I'd then be drawing upon everything I've done for 40 years and saying, okay, well, what is a world-class education then? What is something that can apply to every age group and actually isn't as rigid and as straitjacketed as our national curriculum is? And that kind of, I mean, we can talk about that in a question and answer later, but it kind of leads me on to what Steve just talked about, but also the next thing on the slide, which is the importance of collaborative learning. So the big thing that parents, well, and I worry about really when I'm meeting parents, is children should not be isolated in their learning. You know, children need to be not just socializing with other children, but they need to be learning alongside other children. Because it's only when they're in collaborative learning that they have collaborative talk. And it's only when they're collaboratively talking that they're actually processing the knowledge that's been provided. So for me, talk in any learning scenario it's more than the cement of the teaching and learning. It's the very foundation of it. Because otherwise we've got this input transmission model. And if that worked, then everything that anyone has ever said to me, I would know. And I don't know, because I only know the stuff that I can pull through my consciousness, my understanding, my cognitive capacity, and make sense of. And so we have to think about not just pulling our children out of school, but how do we put them in learning scenarios where they're not just playing with children, but they're actually problem solving together? Because we know that collaborative learning enables children to work at a higher order thinking level. And I mean, these are all nicely sort of weaving into each other. So that means I think the best practice is where a home educating family links up with other home educating families. Just before I move on to that, I should say I'm often talking a lot of families down. When I do an initial visit and then I'm supposed to follow up 3 months later, and that I'm supposed to return on an annual basis. And I have to say, I work with the most fabulous parents. But when I first meet them, they've often got something that looks exactly like a school curriculum. Oh, well, we've got a timetable and we're going to do this, and I've got a Zoom learning here, and I've got this. And I say to them, why have you pulled them out of school? You don't have to do any of this. And I start saying, of course, you might want to track the national curriculum. And of course, I'm trying to reassure the parents they don't have to be that anxious. So, of course, I compromise until they know me much better and say, well, why don't you do some English in the morning? Why don't you do some maths in the morning? Why don't you do, that? But then why don't the afternoons become the kind of thing you actually want to do? So I'm often turning parents down rather than turning them up. And I shared this analogy, I think, with Daisy when we were designing this. And I said, because the argument, well, eventually they're going to have to do that. When they're 16, they've got to take those exams. That's like putting a little cozy coupe car in a 2-year-old and then insisting that it drives it on the left. Because eventually they're going to have to pass a test when they're 17. You don't have to, it is almost as illogical as that we don't have to put them in an earlier stage through all of this in order that they then channel it all down so they passed exams when they are 16. What we can do, because when we create these very broad structures, actually, it's just towards the business end of things that you can start narrowing it down, channeling it down, focusing it, such that they will pass those exams. And I've got evidence that that is a far more successful way, because a child is coming to it with high self-confidence and self-esteem. So definitely, I think you need to think not just about providing the knowledge, the input. I think you need to be thinking about the collaboration. And some of the families that I work with, they've just been incredibly influential and powerful networking. And sometimes, the days when you could all meet up in large groups inside and outside, there were things like a pottery making course. One of the parents happens to, have a studio thing. And, the children came around and learned how to pot. Another family actually got a science specialist who was able to do the GCSE. She got accreditation to do that. Another family, every week they do an arts and crafts session. The de rigueur, if you like, is that they meet up in parks and they do foraging and forest school work. But I would definitely be thinking of things like that. And again, I think I've frothed at the mouth long enough. I'm gonna pause and pick up any questions.
Can I just ask a practical question? How do you get in contact with other people who are homeschooling?
Very active Facebook groups. I think, I don't know, because I've taken the view that those Facebook groups are completely for them, and in some respects I'm seen as the enemy. So therefore I don't get involved in any of that. But I do know that there are Facebook groups, and I do know that they talk about us, and I do know that my name crops up a lot. And generally my family say, "Oh, it's all right, Val. You come out of this quite well." And that's the other thing that I would say is, don't be afraid of a local authority, because you might well get somebody like me. I'm not saying you definitely will, and I know of some authorities who deserve to be taken to court, because what I've heard they're doing is shocking. But I work with 7 other advisors who I don't think I'm on a different page to. I may well be at one end of experience and therefore more confidence in being able to go off piste and advise in that way. But I really wouldn't be afraid. I would give them a chance, and then you can always revert to written report. That's your choice. But you might well get someone who, my job mostly, because I suppose I've been in teacher education, I see my parents as part of my teacher education role. And I'm trying to make them the best possible resource they can be for their child. And therefore, I'm trying to build their confidence, and I'm trying to reassure them and take out the anxiety that they have, because that's no good to a child. A child, doesn't have to have a stressed, anxious parent who's trying to further their education. So I see that. I call upon that part of my training, if you like, to try and make them feel empowered to be the best possible one teacher that they can for their child.
Can I just add to that? Because I've been reaching out in my local area a bit lately to try and find out a bit more about local networks. And there are actually, probably not surprisingly to a lot of people on this call, because so many children have been pulled out of school in the last year, there are several sort of groups and organisations, none of whom I'm in a position to be able to particularly condone, but certainly I'd recommend having a look at them to see what you think of them. There are Telegram groups. There's one called the National Community Schools Project Chat, and they have a separate group for each county. So for example, there would be NCS Bedfordshire. I think at the moment, last I checked, there was a small anomaly for Hertfordshire, but almost every county has an NCS and then space name of the county group on Telegram, where you can be in touch with some local parents and teachers who are prepared to provide some services to that group. So that might be one way of doing it. And there's also another organisation called Freedom Education UK. Again, I haven't particularly looked into what their drivers are, but I assume they have similar drivers to people on this call, so it's worth having a look at those as well for other people to connect with, perhaps.
And I have thought of another aspect to this, which I haven't focused on. So at the moment, I'm just kind of giving you the cozy, sweet bundle joy method of how to homeschool your children. Now, at some point, your child is going to want as many post-16 options as any other child, because home education shouldn't be a disadvantaging factor at all. And I can reassure you that I've had children who have been home educated for the entirety of their secondary school education and have taken some GCSEs, managed to get to a college post-16, doing all kinds of things, and then ended up in a Russell Group university on the most competitive of courses. So no child should be disadvantaged by the decision their parent makes to home educate them. So depending what you want for your child. So when I'm first there, even if it's quite a young child, I am there talking to the parents about the end goal. I am there talking about, you know, when you're no longer responsible for your child's education, what do you want for them? And if they themselves are, you know, the recipients of a higher education degree, then they want that for their child. So we do have to have that in mind. So as long as I remain their advisor, we're kind of all the time thinking of how do we get to there? And it's about the age of about 13 that I'm, you know, starting to say, well, how are they going to cash all this in? Because at some point they've got to have the keys to open the next phase of their life. And I'm very lucky. In my authority, I have a college which draws down its own funding independently of school to provide pre-16 education from year 9. And full-time school doesn't always suit children. It's not very often I can return them to school. I can if they're younger and if they want to, of course. I don't, when I say return, it's never my decision. But I can very, very successfully get them to think about going to college on a part-time basis from year 9. I work with a fabulous college manager who is an angel in human form, who looks after these children, provides the courses that they want. And, you know, how lucky am I? Actually, we worked out quite recently. She was one of my student teachers back in the day, but neither of us recognized each other. But anyway, so I'm going to claim all the credit for what a wonderful person she is. But anyway, so she is doing this in my authority. Now, every authority will have colleges, I believe, or should have, who are drawing down their funding. And that means you've got a golden passage at the end of your child's compulsory education, because they can take GCSEs. You don't have to provide the tutors, the exam conditions, the fees. So in my case here, they can go for a pre-GCSE education in year 9, 3 days a week, short days. In year 10, they can take a couple of GCSEs, maybe up to even 4, but they do them in a year in college. They don't do them over 2 years. So although 4 doesn't sound very much, it's the equivalent of 8. And then they can do another 4 in year 11. Now, then they don't even need 8, to be honest. That's another thing, you know, why schools are giving children 11, 12 GCSEs is only for their own good. It's not really for children. No child needs to do that number to get into the next phase of education or even to get to university. And I've been a university admissions tutor, so I know this. So you don't have to load them up on this gravy train of qualifications. You can get the ones that are going to give them access to A-level provision at college, or a vocational course, or a skills for employment course, or whatever is suitable for that child. So if you're somebody like me that would like to know eventually where this might end up, you might want to research that just to see whether your local authority or your county does provide that sort of provision. Any other questions on any of that?
Hi, Val.
Hi.
I wanted to ask if you had any experience about kind of groups of families getting together and kind of forming kind of educational pods, maybe even employing, you know, a teacher part-time. I think you'd mentioned a science specialist. It's just something I'm quite interested in knowing if it's actually, if it actually happens anywhere.
Yeah, so the science is a good example of that. She had a sort of studio in her garden. She was a science teacher, but bringing up her own children. And I don't know how she managed it, but she actually managed to be an exam accreditor for the practical bit. And then she procured an exam centre where the children could be external candidates. So if you don't do the college route and you want them to get GCSEs and you whatever, that's what you've got to do. And you still want them to get GCSEs, which they could do post 16 at college, remember, but if you wanted them to do it in line with their peers, then you're going to need to, there's an organisation called Tutors and Exams. Now they provide tutors and exams for any syllabus, any exam board, any subject. And for the very anxious learners, they even do home invigilation of exams. However, that's going to cost. That is going to cost. But if you do the pre-16 route for college, it doesn't cost you anything. So it all depends really on what your particular needs are for your children. But certainly I have come across people who do employ a specialist. They don't tend to employ academic specialists, except for that science group I mentioned. They tend to try and access the academic curriculum through either printed conventional resources, and I don't work for this organisation, but the best one that I've come across are the CGP books. And there you can get them by key stage or by year. And you do need to, and there's such a plethora of them. Certainly up to key stage 3, it's reasonably straightforward, but after that it becomes syllabus specific. But if you wanted, if you wanted to follow an academic curriculum and leading them up to GCSEs or whatever, then I would recommend, if you're going to get printed resources, there are also LETS, there's also Pearson, there's also those, but the CGP ones are the ones that most children work well with, and they're the ones that my own children came home with when they were at school, because actually the schools often follow those as well for supplementary work. But in other cases, parents have their academic provision through subscription to online providers. And there's organisations such as Interhigh, and I've heard on some of the chat groups people saying, yeah, but they send your details to local authorities. Local authorities won't do anything with that. So whilst that might be the case, and I don't work for Interhigh, so I don't know, local authorities, we can be a little bit too worried about the surveillance. Local authorities have got so much on; they're not going to pay any attention. I've never ever heard that we've got news a parent's been home educating through any of those online providers telling the local authority. So have a look at Interhigh, that gets good reports. EdPlace is another one. Khan Academy is a completely free online American educational platform. Now, the reason I like that is because it obviously doesn't follow the national curriculum because it's American, but it has the most wonderful videos of things like how to do pottery or how to do whatever. And again, if you didn't follow it systematically, and it would be a poor practice if you did actually, but if you just cherry picked some of the things that would take up an afternoon for your child, I think you'd have a good time with that.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And I wonder whether it would be possible for you to provide us with a sheet of these resources which you know about and you're mentioning during this time, but which we could later on have a look at ourselves.
Certainly. I mean, because I'm still self-employed and procured by the local authority, it's the reason I'm running a little bit under the radar here. But why don't we agree, Daisy, that I'll send that to you, and then you can, is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah. Or yeah, or are there online links to any of it that we can distribute?
No, okay. No, it leads you to the local authority, so I'd have to download it, print it, and then send it.
Yeah. No, I think I'm fairly sure I'm able to email to everyone who's attending.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sure.
Is it another question around the idea of how, I think for most parents, and myself included in that, one of the biggest stumbling blocks is managing a full-time job, and particularly younger children who might be less able to kind of be set loose on a task and do it.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about potentially different models of how we can work around that?
And I think what's overwhelming about that is the fact that you might start with thinking you've got to do everything a school does, and remember, you don't. Okay, so that's the most freeing thing I think you need to reward yourself with, is that it doesn't have to look like school education. So therefore, you're not trying to get 6 hours in a day. Now there was only recently, within the last 10 years, we've only had full-time actually assigned a number of hours, and apparently it's between 20 and 25. But remember, for me and most sensible advisors, 20 hours also involves going to the park. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be, it's not 20 hours at a desk. It could be making a cake together. It could be making invisible ink. It could be a treasure map. It could be any of those things. So, you know, yes, you can easily demonstrate. You're probably already demonstrating 20 hours of learning with your child. Okay, so I came across a single parent recently with a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old, literally only sort of 11 or 12 months between them, who works. And, you know, that was I haven't had anything quite as challenging as that, but she took her child out of school for all the reasons we would take our child out of school: the mask, the social distancing, the testing, the fearful environment that the school had become. So of course I wanted to support her 100%. Interestingly enough, the school had written to us if there was any safeguarding concerns, and they'd written extreme views about the COVID crisis. And I had to smile, because if anyone had extreme views, which was obliging parents to turn up in the playground to collect their children with masks. So I was very clear to write on that report to the local authority that I thought she had, that in fact it was almost the opposite, you know, that this woman had very sensible views about the COVID crisis and whatever. What she did was she set her children up with all sorts of learning apps on an iPad, because they're too young, you know, but again, this was a challenge. And she worked in the morning. So they got into a routine of having breakfast together, and then she'd give them various things to do. And because they liked being on their iPads or devices, then she worked for 3 or 4 hours of the day. And she just obviously checked on them, and, you know, she was in the same room often. And then they stopped at lunchtime, and then every day they would go out and they'd do their outdoor education, which was physical exercise, nature, geography, science, through being out for an hour or two in all weathers. And then they'd come back, and then they'd do their arts and crafts, creativity. So for me, I am advising parents, you know, as well as their intellectual capacity that you're building, you know, the most intellectual capacity can be built usually through also developing their creativity. And we need to have an eye on that. It's not just how are they progressing in terms of being more fluent at reading, or are they doing their 4 number forms or whatever. It's, are they experimenting with color, design, form, shape? Are they dreaming big? You know, I'll just show, I don't want to go too much into educational research. Of course, I've got loads of that. I was nearly 30 years in higher education, but I do want to share this little bit to you, that I was quite a young, I was in my 20s, and I'd gone to this conference. I was really lucky to do it because it was connecting up with overseas. And there was one of my luminaries in education. She was called Margaret Meeks Spencer, and I think she was in her 80s then. And she said a couple of things that just have stayed with me the rest of my career. She said, she talked about assessment, and she said, whoever thought you make the baby heavier by keep weighing it. And, you know, you can see into that, can't you? We're so bothered about outcomes and measuring them, we forget to feed the baby. And so that has stayed with me. The other thing she said was that she'd conducted this research project where she knew of, she worked with an anthropologist, where they worked with a tribe that didn't have any literacy. It was a verbal only tribe, and they were trying to teach them how to be literate and numerate and whatever. And it was functioning, it was all functioning skills, you know, like spelling and drills and things. And then so they had one group doing that, how to get them to be literate, how to transcribe what they are saying in their language, and really taking them through a very reductionist model of, you know, if you do it enough times, you'll learn it. And then she had another group where they did a little bit of that, but not a lot, but they taught them another language. And the ones who learned the other language were the ones who became more fluent at the written literacy skills than the ones who were banging on about it all the time and only had that. Now, for me, that completely made sense, because you were introducing creativity, you were introducing, you know, communication on a different level of for the purpose of being able to communicate with somebody else. So again, I offer that to you, saying we can care too much about reducing it to flashcards, phonics, spellings. It's not always the way that children learn best. And sometimes the scenic route, the creative route, you know, where they learn to read in the company of authors rather than through synthetic, oh gosh, I've just seen the new teacher training curriculum, thank goodness I'm not in it anymore, where there's got to be a focus on systematic synthetic phonics. Every child's got to go through that. That is not how some children learn to read. They learn to read because they learn to behave like a reader, because they learn that what they are making sense of through pictures and through someone mediating the print is to enjoy fiction for pleasure, and because the words on the page actually mean something exciting to them. Now, how does any of that work with a systematic synthetic phonics approach? You know, that's good for children who have had years of not learning to read, and that's a remedial step. It's not the way that everybody learns to read. And certainly starting off as emergent readers, they just need to have really good stories that they are mediating with an expert reader. Well, we've gone over, Daisy, so may not want to keep people too much longer.
That's fine. Perhaps just if you're able to stay on for a couple of minutes more, Val, just open up to a couple more questions.
Yeah, of course, I am. I've got no hurry.
Yeah, I can stay on for the next 10 or so if need be.
I had another question. Do you think there's a kind of core thing which home educated children perhaps miss out on if they're not getting the usual school experience? And if so, what steps can be taken to kind of minimize that?
My biggest worry is when children are isolated. My biggest worry is when they're adolescents and teenagers and they're isolated. That's the stage when they have to be most tribal in their education, I feel. And we know that adolescents and teenagers need to be part of a group. Younger children, their families, their group. But adolescents and teenagers are breaking out from being only in that group and wanting their own. And so I worry when there's an adolescent or a teenager who is learning in an isolated way with an online platform, and they don't want it, the parent doesn't need to be supervising children. They can actually go to work because the teenager's not there saying, you know, please stay with me or whatever. So the parent doesn't see the need for it. The problem I've come across, and I've come across unfortunately more times than I want, is that need for group approval, for somebody else, for social interaction, has led to that child online, unsupervising, accessing material and chat rooms I don't want them to be in. And it has led to some fairly dangerous outcomes. I probably pick up one child a year who's sexually exploited in that way. And so, you know, to mitigate against that, you have to build in social interaction with other adolescents and teens. I'd say that's essential, because then they don't fulfill that craving in inappropriate ways.
Thank you. Just a kind of a related point, what about the actual, you know, I guess the kind of traditional, you know, desk-based learning, you know, large groups, being in front of a teacher? You know, do you think younger kids are missing out by not having that?
I don't actually think that's how we are as humans programmed to learn, actually. I think we learn through I think language is the actual foundation of learning. So there's all kinds of educational theory, and the one that I ascribe to most is the one that says children learn through the social interaction with more expert others. And alongside, in many years ago, and we're going back a couple of decades, we're talking, there's a it became educational. It started off as psychological study of how children learn, but it's the idea that children learn best when they are taken outside of their comfort zone. So you have to get the level of challenge right. You have to, it's as damaging to give a child unchallenging work as it is to give them challenging work that they can't access. So good teaching is taking them through what they already know and then a bit beyond. And it's called the zone of proximal development. So every child will have a learning edge. And so some kind of expert, somebody who knows a bit more than them, and when I say somebody, it could be material they read, but that's not the most, that's an inferior model really, who takes them beyond that into how to grow from what they currently know and understand into what they don't yet know and understand, but will do if they had assistance. Now, that's what those large groups with a teacher in front of them could do. However, to really make sense of what that input is, they need to be talking to each other. So yes, you can have the input in this large group, but then you need the small group work in order to match it to what you know and can already do. So does that make sense, Kirsty?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think I guess it's just having confidence as a parent that you're not depriving your child in some way of that, you know, typical experience.
The typical experience, the national curriculum, I should say, was only ever designed back in the late 80s for groups of no more than 25. Now, if your children are in secondary schools or even in primary schools, there won't be a single classroom around well, there will be a few classrooms, but the majority of classrooms are bigger than the national curriculum was ever designed for. That tells you in itself, it was never properly funded to be as successful as it could have been. And even then, I have, philosophical issues about how it was compartmentalized. And I have observed the national curriculum descend into more and more ways that I am opposed to, if you like. So when it first came out, there was nothing in the English curriculum, for which I'm a specialist, that I could object to, because it was about critical reading, critical thinking, critical skills, the onus on a range of things, including critiquing media texts and stuff that comes at children from the television, from magazines. I've looked at it quite recently because it's gone through various evolutions, and I looked at it quite recently, and I could hardly find the word critical. And the new teacher training program, we can't find that in there either. So, it's easy to think, well, I'm a parent and I can't measure up to what they're doing in schools. I want to reassure you that what they're doing in schools is getting worse and worse anyway.
Thank you.
Any more questions, anyone? Last chance to pick Val's brains.
I just wanted to say to Val that this has been a really uplifting experience, and thank you very much indeed.
Oh, well, no, thank you for joining.
Likewise.
Yeah, I was going to say thank you ever so much, Val, for what's been an incredibly informative and reassuring experience. I think for a lot of us, it's felt like it's too much to consider to actually work out the logistics of it, and it's very nice to hear reassurance that it is working for other people, and how we can find ways to make it work for ourselves as well. So I
think it's time, I suppose, isn't it? Time, how to work and play.
Yeah,
I think the only time you need to really go, right, what am I doing with this, is when they get to about 13, 14, because then you're saying, how do I get them the qualifications they need to access the stage they don't need me for? And up until then, to be quite honest, every day with you, even if they only did a very small amount of academic or what they do in schools, they're still going to probably come out better than if they had been in school.
The main concern is that they might be on screens or something whilst you're trying to work, you see?
Yeah, that isn't a very good, obviously, for all the reasons I've said. There are some e-safety concerns about that. But, I would try and make sure that the screening bit is not the majority of their education. I would try and make sure that even if they're using books or and try and make sure that you are mediating it a bit. The odd YouTube video is fine, isn't it? And an online provider where they're doing their English and maths is fine, but try and make sure everything else is about developing their curiosity to learn themselves.
And thinking about it, Val, mine are a bit young at the moment, but although the way things are looking with preschools at the moment, I'm not sure whether I might look at trying to take them out there as well. But it occurs to me that a workable system might be having a day, working a 4-day week or a 4.5-day week, so that each parent of a group can take half a day or a day with the kids' responsibility. And my next thought was, well, how do we know these parents are safe people? Can we access a process of do we ask people to is DBS check the right thing to do for child safety? How would we think about that?
I'll do I've done DPS. I would definitely. It's only a month full. It just means they haven't been caught if they've done anything
Yeah.
Right, but yeah, it's not necessarily a bad thing.
I
No,
don't
it's not
think
all that reassuring.
I don't think the authorities would work with you as individuals, because that would be data protection. So
But you can still
I
get
have-
a certificate. You can still get a certificate and share it with each other as a part of due diligence.
oh
on each
yeah,
other.
you can do it on a voluntary basis and on a mutually respectful basis.
Yeah.
However, I've never heard of families doing that.
I suppose there's probably a high element of trust between people who've met each other and know each other.
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
So basically, what you're suggesting is quite a clever idea. So everyone takes a day off a week,
Or half a day.
design a program with each other
Yeah.
in a small space, and they can shift their kids around, and then they get the social element and aspects as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Montessori, you have different age groups and stuff.
Yeah.
You would probably, I mean, yes, you've got then a day or half day to give to the cooperative, but you'd probably want a day on your own with your kids as well. So I actually would talk you down from doing as much work as you are doing, really. I worked 3 days a week until my children went to secondary school, and I'm really glad that I did.
Yeah. Do you know much about the international baccalaureate system? I'm just wondering. I've sort of have increasingly less faith in the importance of GCSEs.
Yeah. I do have some, because I used to teach international school teachers who all worked with the IB. It does seem because it's got an element of service in it, hasn't it? It's got a sense of community, and it's got some requirements for language and having a broader based education. The only problem is the schools I've come across who ran it soon dropped it. And I don't know why they did, but the children actually felt that they were even more on a conveyor belt to tick boxes.
It is, yeah, but it's internationally recognised for if you're going down that academic route, isn't it? Like you can go anywhere in the world with that.
You can with A levels. To be fair, you can with A levels. It doesn't for our citizens. Open doors.
I think we've got to consider what is education for and what we're doing for. I never finished school. I went back and done an access course and then picked out that way. So there is always that route. There's a different route to market, not just traditional route. And I've been
and there's no finishing line that they're dashing towards. I say things like, you don't have to get your GCSEs by 16. You can get them when you go to college after 16, and then nobody pays for anything.
Yeah.
I think there'll be a wave of new. I think there's a concern in any parent. There'll be, they're not gonna fit into this system that's been designed for us colonialism, but they can do it. They can access it if they want to another way. Doesn't
just
have to be
just one very practical point. If you are considering college education for any of your children, they are getting hugely busy with pre-16 for obvious reasons. This hemorrhaging of children coming out of schools, but then this channeling of children into Key Stage 4 education where colleges offer it. And they used to be able to take children in my local college up until May, June. I used to say, apply before June, you'll be fine. I'm now saying to parents, apply before Christmas for the following September, because there is this bulge, and some of our colleges are saying, actually, we haven't got room to grow this. And so there are families that are sadly on the waiting list, but will never get a place. So if you are ever considering the college, think about it a year before you want them to go.
Thanks, Val.
Okay, anyway, we're going to ramble on, aren't we?
Just quickly, what do you think about this online method then? Because you could, that's increasingly, but I looked at something called like an online school, but there's like 400 kids in a class and they do it online and all this thing.
I don't think you've taken out your child from school to give them an inferior model of education. And for me, that is. It's still straitjacketed, it's still compartmentalized, they're still impersonalized. They might as well be masked, really, mightn't they? So I would steer clear of those.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So I think we'll
Okay.
wind up there. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, Val, for all
Thanks,
your
everyone. Bye.
extremely valuable help. And I will ensure that I pass on the documents to all of you who have attended today that Val's referred to.
Yeah.
I'll get them to you
It'll
by
take
email.
me, I can't do it today, so it'll take me a little while to get to access them, but I will, yeah.
Perfect. That sounds absolutely
Okay,
great.
all right
Thanks,
then.
Val.
Thank
You're
you.
Bye,
Bye then.
everyone.
Bye.